The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Wall Street in 1921. Outside, the city hummed with a new energy, something that hadn't been felt since before the war. The Dow Jones Industrial Average stood at just 63 points that August morning. A quiet number, almost humble. But there was something stirring in the air, something that would change how Americans thought about money, about risk, about the very possibility of becoming rich. Picture this scene, if you will, the trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange in the early 1920s. Men in dark suits and suspenders moved between the trading posts like dancers in some elaborate choreography. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the constant chatter of prices being called out. Ticker tape machines clattered in the corner, their mechanical rhythm marking time like a heartbeat. These were different days, simpler days in some ways. A man could walk into a brokerage house wearing his best suit, the one he wore to church on Sundays, and with just a small amount of cash, he could buy stocks worth many times what he actually possessed. This was called buying on margin, and it was about to change everything. Let me tell you about Charles Mitchell. He was the president of National City Bank, a man with silver hair and the kind of confidence that made other men listen when he spoke. Mitchell had a vision. He believed that every American, not just the wealthy, should have the chance to participate in the great engine of capitalism that was driving the country forward. Mitchell's bank began offering loans to ordinary people so they could buy stocks. Not just the wealthy industrialists who had always played the market, but shopkeepers and clerks and teachers. The American dream was expanding, and Mitchell was one of its chief architects. But there was something else happening in those quiet offices and marble halls of finance. The Federal Reserve, that great guardian of the nation's money supply, began lowering interest rates. From 6% in 1924, down to 4% by 1927. Money became cheaper, easier to borrow, and when money flows like water, people find remarkable ways to use it. Imagine walking through Manhattan in 1925. The city was transforming before everyone's eyes. Construction cranes reached toward the sky like mechanical prayers. The Empire State Building was still just a dream, but everywhere you looked, steel and stone were reaching higher and higher. The industrial sectors, iron and steel, manufacturing, automobiles, were doubling their gains year after year. And ordinary Americans began to notice something wonderful happening in their newspapers. The stock prices they had never paid attention to before were climbing. Not just climbing, soaring. There was a shoeshine boy named Tommy who worked outside the Morgan Bank building. Every morning, the same bankers and brokers would stop for their daily shine. And Tommy began to listen to their conversations. Radio Corporation of America was up 3 points. General Electric was showing remarkable strength. US Steel was hitting new highs almost every week. Tommy started buying a few shares here and there with his tips. $5, $10, whatever he could spare. And something magical happened. Those few shares began to grow. By 1926, the conversation had changed completely. It wasn't just the wealthy talking about stocks anymore. It was everyone. The barber would mention his latest investment while cutting your hair. The woman at the grocery store would discuss her small portfolio while weighing your potatoes. Stock ownership was becoming democratic. There was a man named John Raskob who worked for DuPont. He was also the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, a serious man with serious responsibilities. But Raskob saw what was happening, and he decided to write an article for a popular magazine. The title was simple and direct. Do you sincerely want to be rich? In this article, Raskob laid out a plan that seemed almost too good to be true. If a young man could save just $15 a month, $15, and invest it wisely in stocks, he could become wealthy. Not just comfortable, wealthy. The mathematics were compelling. The dream was intoxicating. The pool operations began around this time. These were sophisticated arrangements where groups of wealthy investors would coordinate their buying and selling to move stock prices in profitable directions. Radio Corporation of America became a favorite target in 1928. The pools would place large orders, carefully timed, creating the appearance of tremendous demand. Other investors, seeing the sudden surge in volume and price, would rush to buy. The stock would climb higher and higher. Then, at just the right moment, the pool operators would sell everything they owned. The price would collapse, but they had already taken their profits. It was manipulation, but it was perfectly legal. Jesse Livermore understood pools better than almost anyone. Livermore had grown up poor in Massachusetts, the son of a farmer who wanted him to follow in the traditional way of working the land. But Jesse had different ideas. He was fascinated by numbers, by patterns, by the strange psychology that drove prices up and down. He started in what were called bucket shops, small gambling parlors where people could bet on stock price movements without actually owning any shares. It was considered disreputable, almost criminal. But Livermore had a gift. He could read the tape, the record of price movements, like other men read novels. By the late 1920s, Livermore had become legendary. He had made and lost several fortunes already. But he understood something that most investors didn't. Markets move in cycles. What goes up eventually comes down. And when that happens, there's just as much money to be made on the falling prices as there was on the rising ones. But that knowledge was still in the future. In 1927 and 1928, almost everything was going up. The brokers' loans, the money that banks and individuals were lending to stock speculators, began to reach extraordinary levels. By August of 1929, these loans totaled more than $8.5 billion. That was more than all the currency circulating in the entire United States. Think about that for a moment. People had borrowed more money to buy stocks than there was actual cash in the whole country. The margin requirements were remarkably generous in those days. A small investor could borrow more than 2/3 of a stock's face value. If you wanted to buy $100 worth of stock, you only needed to put up $30 of your own money. The bank would lend you the rest. It seemed like magic. Your $30 could control $100 worth of stock. If the stock went up 10%, you didn't make $3 on your $30 investment. You made $10. That was a 33% return on your actual money. And the stocks kept going up. There was an economist at Yale named Irving Fisher. Professor Fisher was considered one of the brightest financial minds in the country. He had written scholarly papers about market behavior and economic theory. His opinions were sought after by newspapers and government officials. In September of 1929, Professor Fisher made a statement that would follow him for the rest of his life. Stock prices, he declared, had reached a permanently high plateau. The old rules didn't apply anymore. American industry was so productive, so innovative, so fundamentally strong, that stock prices would simply continue to rise year after year. It was a comforting thought. It was also about to be proven catastrophically wrong. But in those golden days of September 1929, Professor Fisher's statement seemed perfectly reasonable. The Dow Jones Industrial Average had climbed from 63 points in August 1921 to 381 points by September 1929, a six-fold increase in just 8 years. The Standard & Poor's Composite Average showed a price-to-earnings ratio of 32.6. In simpler terms, investors were paying $32 for every dollar of annual company earnings. That was well above historical norms, but somehow it felt justified. These were extraordinary times. The stories of sudden wealth were everywhere. A secretary who had bought 50 shares of Radio Corporation of America stock had watched her investment grow from $500 to over $2,000. A taxi driver in Chicago had turned a $100 investment into enough money to buy a small house. These weren't fairy tales. These were real people with real gains, living in the same neighborhoods and shopping at the same stores as everyone else. But something was happening beneath the surface, something that most people couldn't see or chose to ignore. In late September, a man named Roger Babson stood up at a conference and made a prediction. Babson was a statistician and business forecaster, not particularly famous but respected in financial circles. He looked out at his audience and said something that sent a shiver through the markets. "Sooner or later," Babson said, "a crash is coming, and it may be terrific." The market dropped 10% almost immediately. They called it the Babson break. But after a few days of uncertainty, prices began to recover. It seemed like just another temporary setback in the great bull market. October arrived with a crisp feeling in the air. The leaves in Central Park were beginning to turn gold and red. Children walked to school wearing light sweaters for the first time since spring. It was a beautiful autumn in New York City. On October 3rd, Philip Snowden, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, made an offhand comment to a reporter. He called the American stock market a speculative orgy. The words appeared in newspapers the next morning, and somehow they stuck in people's minds. A speculative orgy. It was a harsh phrase, but it captured something that many people were beginning to feel but hadn't been able to put into words. The steady climb of stock prices was starting to feel unnatural, disconnected from the real world of factories and farms and honest work. The selling began slowly. A few large investors decided to take some profits. Nothing dramatic, nothing that couldn't be absorbed by the constant flow of new money coming into the market. But selling has a way of creating more selling. When prices start to drop, the investors who have borrowed heavily on margin receive calls from their brokers. They need to put up more cash to cover their loans, or their stocks will be sold automatically. By mid-October, the Federal Reserve had begun to express concern about the level of speculation in the markets. They directed member banks to curb their lending to stock speculators. The easy money that had fueled the great boom was starting to dry up. October 21st was a Monday. The selling that had been sporadic and manageable suddenly became more intense. Prices dropped sharply throughout the day. The ticker tape machines, those mechanical heartbeats of the market, began to fall behind as the volume of trading increased. Tuesday was worse. Wednesday brought no relief. And then came Thursday, October 24th, 1929. They would remember it forever as Black Thursday. The opening bell rang at 10 o'clock that morning, just as it had every trading day for decades. But within minutes, it was clear that something extraordinary was happening. The selling orders poured in like a flood. Not the careful, considered selling of professional investors taking profits. This was panic. In the first 3 minutes of trading, nearly 3 million shares changed hands. 3 million shares in 3 minutes. The dollar value of wealth that evaporated in those first moments was approximately $2 million. Gone. Just gone. The ticker tape machines couldn't keep up. The mechanical arms that printed the prices moved as fast as they could, but the volume was simply too much. Soon, the prices being printed were hours behind the actual trading. Investors across the country were making decisions based on information that was no longer current. By 11 o'clock, the market had lost 11% of its value. The floor of the New York Stock Exchange, usually a place of controlled chaos, had descended into something closer to bedlam. But then something remarkable happened. A man in an expensive suit walked purposefully to the trading post where US steel was bought and sold. He raised his hand and called out in a clear, strong voice, "I'll take 25,000 shares at $205. The crowd fell silent for a moment. The current price of US steel was $190. This man was offering to pay $15 more per share than anyone else was willing to pay, for 25,000 shares. It was an enormous order, over $5 million. The man was Richard Whitney, and he was the vice president of the New York Stock Exchange. More importantly, he was known to represent the interests of J.P. Morgan, the most powerful financial institution in America. Whitney's bold bid sent a message that echoed throughout the trading floor. The House of Morgan was stepping in. The giants of American finance were not going to let the market collapse. After placing his order for US steel, Whitney walked to other trading posts: American Telephone and Telegraph, General Electric. At each post, he made large purchases at prices above the current market. The panic began to subside. Cheers actually went up from the trading floor. Grown men, serious financiers, applauded like children at a baseball game. The crisis was over. The steady hands of experienced moneymen had saved the day. By the closing bell, the Dow Jones Industrial Average had fallen only 2.09%. After the morning's panic, it felt like a victory. The newspapers the next day told the story with barely concealed relief. "Richard Whitney halts stock panic," read one headline. The financial pages were full of praise for the quick thinking and bold action that had prevented disaster. But Whitney and his colleagues knew something that the newspapers didn't print. Their intervention hadn't really stopped the selling. It had only postponed it. The weekend brought a false calm. Families went to church on Sunday morning and heard sermons about the importance of steady faith in turbulent times. Children played in the fallen leaves. The world felt normal again. Monday, October 28th, brought more selling. The efforts to support the market on Thursday had been expensive, and there was little appetite for repeating them. The Dow fell again, and the margin calls began in earnest. When investors can't meet their margin calls, when they can't come up with the additional cash their brokers demand, their stocks are sold automatically. This forced selling drives prices down further, which triggers more margin calls, which creates more forced selling. It's a spiral that feeds on itself, growing stronger and more destructive with each turn. Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, dawned grey and cold in New York City. There was a bite in the air that suggested winter was not far away. The men walking to work on Wall Street pulled their overcoats a little tighter and walked a little faster. They had no way of knowing that this day would be remembered as Black Tuesday, the day that changed everything. The opening bell at 10 o'clock unleashed a torrent of selling unlike anything anyone had ever seen. 16 million shares traded that day. 16 million. The previous record had been less than half that number. The ticker tape machines, already struggling to keep up over the previous week, fell hopelessly behind. The delay between actual trades and printed confirmation grew from minutes to hours. By the afternoon, investors were making decisions in complete darkness, buying and selling stocks without knowing what the current price actually was. $14 billion in stock value simply disappeared that Tuesday. $14 billion. It was more than the entire federal budget of the United States. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell 11.73% in a single day. Combined with Monday's losses, the market had dropped 23.05% in just 2 days. Some of the wealthiest men in America tried desperately to stem the tide. William C. Durant, who had founded General Motors, bought millions of dollars worth of stocks. The Rockefeller family issued a public statement that they were purchasing shares because they believed in the fundamental strength of the country. But their efforts were like trying to stop a flood with a bucket. The selling continued hour after hour, relentless and unstoppable. The ticker tape finally stopped running at 7:45 that evening. In the sudden quiet of the exchange floor, men stood among scattered papers and empty coffee cups, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Jesse Livermore had been watching the developing crisis with the cold eye of a professional speculator. While others panicked, he methodically sold short, betting that prices would fall even further. On Black Tuesday alone, Livermore made over $100 million. It was a fortune beyond imagining, but Livermore took no joy in it. He understood that his profits represented the destruction of thousands of other investors' dreams. The shoeshine boys and secretaries and taxi drivers who had believed in the promise of easy wealth. Their margin calls came like a plague. Small investors who had borrowed heavily to buy stocks found themselves owing more money than they could possibly repay. Their stocks were sold automatically, often at a fraction of what they had paid for them. Life savings, college funds, retirement plans, all wiped out in a matter of days. Professor Irving Fisher watched his permanently high plateau crumble beneath him. The economist who had proclaimed the new era of perpetual growth saw his own investments disappear. His reputation, built over decades of scholarly work, was destroyed in weeks. Charles Mitchell, the banker who had done so much to democratize stock ownership, found himself facing congressional investigations and criminal charges. The easy credit policies that had seemed so beneficial during the boom years now looked reckless and irresponsible. Richard Whitney, the hero of Black Thursday, would eventually be revealed as an embezzler who had stolen from his own clients to cover his losses. The man who had stood tall on the exchange floor and restored confidence through his bold purchases would end up in prison. The crash continued through November and into the winter. Each small rally was met with renewed selling. Each attempt to find a bottom was followed by another leg down. By July 8, 1932, the Dow Jones Industrial Average touched 41 points. From its peak of 381 points in September 1929, the market had lost 90% of its value. 90%. It was almost impossible to comprehend. If you had invested $1,000 at the market's peak, you would have been left with $100 less than 3 years later. But the numbers, as staggering as they were, couldn't capture the human cost. The dreams that were shattered, the trust that was broken, the faith in American capitalism that was wounded so deeply it would take a generation to heal. The crash spawned 1,000 stories, and not all of them were true. Tales of ruined speculators, jumping from Wall Street windows became part of the folklore, though historians would later question whether the epidemic of suicides was real or imagined. What was real was the slow, grinding aftermath. The Great Depression that followed wasn't just a financial event. It was a psychological transformation that changed how Americans thought about risk, about debt, about the very nature of economic security. Unemployment reached 25% by 1933. Banks failed by the thousands. Factories closed. Farms were abandoned. The easy optimism of the 1920s gave way to a harder, more cautious worldview. The government response was sweeping and permanent. The Securities Act of 1933 required companies to provide detailed financial information to investors. The Securities and Exchange Commission was created in 1934 to oversee the markets and prevent the kind of manipulation that had been common in the 20s. The Glass-Steagall Act separated commercial banking from investment banking, ensuring that people's savings deposits couldn't be risked in stock market speculation. These changes would define American finance for the next 70 years. Jesse Livermore, despite his enormous profits from the crash, couldn't escape the curse that seemed to follow all the great speculators of his era. He made and lost several more fortunes in the years that followed. In 1940, alone and nearly broke, he took his own life in the bathroom of a Manhattan hotel. Charles Mitchell lived longer, but never recovered his reputation. The man who had been one of the most powerful financiers in America spent his later years working for small investment firms, largely forgotten by the world that had once hung on his every word. Professor Irving Fisher continued teaching at Yale, but his influence never recovered. Students would sometimes ask about his permanently high plateau comment, and Fisher would shake his head sadly and change the subject. The shoeshine boy, Tommy, he was real, though his name might have been different, lost everything. His small portfolio, built up dollar by dollar from tips and spare change, vanished in the crash. He went back to shining shoes, but he never trusted the stock market again. As the decades passed, new generations of Americans would rediscover the intoxicating appeal of stock market speculation. The details would change. The technology would advance. But the fundamental human emotions of greed and fear would remain constant. In the late 1990s, internet stocks soared to levels that would have made even the speculators of 1929 pause. Companies with no profits and barely any revenue were valued at billions of dollars. Once again, ordinary Americans mortgaged their homes to buy stocks. Once again, shoeshine boys, now perhaps computer technicians, gave stock tips. And once again, the bubble burst. In 2008, easy credit and reckless speculation created another crisis. This time it was houses instead of stocks, but the pattern was eerily familiar. Loans were made to people who couldn't afford them. Complex financial instruments spread the risk throughout the global economy. When the collapse came, it was swift and merciless. In 2021, apps like Robinhood brought stock trading to smartphones, democratizing speculation in ways that Charles Mitchell could never have imagined. Meme stocks like GameStop saw their prices multiply dozens of times in days, driven by social media hype and the dreams of quick wealth. The tools change, the scale changes, but the story remains remarkably consistent. There's something eternal about the human desire to believe that this time is different, that the old rules no longer apply, that we've discovered a new path to prosperity that doesn't require the slow, patient work of building real value. But markets have their own logic, their own rhythms, their own inexorable patterns. What rises rapidly often falls just as quickly. What seems too good to be true usually is. The crash of 1929 wasn't just about numbers on a page or prices on a ticker tape. It was about hope and fear and greed and desperation. It was about ordinary people trying to build better lives for themselves and their families, and sometimes making catastrophic mistakes in the process. It was about the eternal tension between dreams and reality, between what we want to believe and what the cold mathematics of compound interest will actually allow. If you walk down Wall Street today, you can still see some of the buildings that witnessed those dramatic days in October 1929. The New York Stock Exchange still stands at the corner of Wall and Broad Streets, though the trading floor is largely empty now, replaced by computer servers humming quietly in distant data centers. The House of Morgan building, where Richard Whitney once worked, has been converted into other uses. The bucket shops where Jesse Livermore learned his craft are long gone, replaced by sleek brokerage apps that can be downloaded to any smartphone. But sometimes, in the early morning light filtering through those tall windows, you can almost hear the echoes of that long-ago excitement. The voices calling out bids and offers, the clatter of ticker tape machines, the dreams and fears of thousands of people betting everything on their vision of the future. The crash of 1929 taught America many lessons. Some of those lessons were learned well and led to important reforms that protected investors for generations. Others were forgotten and had to be learned again, painfully, in subsequent booms and busts. Perhaps the most important lesson is also the hardest to remember in the excitement of a bull market. Sustainable wealth is built slowly, carefully, with patience and discipline. The shortcuts that promise instant riches usually lead to disappointment. But each new generation seems to need to learn this lesson for itself. The details change. The names change. But the fundamental story of human nature remains the same. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about those October days in 1929. Think about the ordinary Americans who trusted their savings to a market they didn't fully understand. Think about the speculators who confused luck with skill. Think about the reformers who tried to build a better system from the ashes of the old one. Their story is our story. Their dreams and fears and hopes are ours as well. The numbers have changed, but the human heart remains constant. The crash of 1929 reminds us that markets are not machines. They are human institutions, driven by human emotions, subject to human frailties. Understanding that truth, really understanding it, might be the most valuable lesson the past can teach us about the future. And in that understanding, perhaps we can find not just caution, but wisdom, not just fear, but respect for the awesome power of human ambition and the humble recognition of our own limitations. The ticker tape has stopped running. The voices have grown quiet. But the story continues, written each day by new dreamers and new risk-takers, all trying to find their own path to prosperity in an uncertain world. Sleep well and dream carefully. Tomorrow the markets will open again. The morning after Black Tuesday brought an eerie quiet to Wall Street. The same buildings stood where they had always stood. The same street lamps cast their familiar shadows. But something fundamental had changed in the night. Something that couldn't be seen, but could be felt in every conversation, every glance, every hesitant step. The newspaper boys arrived early that Wednesday morning, their voices echoing off the stone facades as they called out the headlines. Market loses billions. Stocks crash in record trading. But their usual enthusiasm was muted. Even they seemed to sense that this was different from the usual financial news. In the small apartments and boarding houses where many of the Wall Street clerks lived, men sat at their kitchen tables staring at pieces of paper. Margin call notices, demands for immediate payment of loans they could never hope to repay. The numbers might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the sense they made. There was a man named Robert who worked as a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing company in Brooklyn. He had never considered himself a speculator, but in 1928, his brother-in-law had convinced him to buy some shares of Radio Corporation of America. Just 50 shares. It seemed like such a small risk at the time. Robert had used his savings, $300, as a down payment and borrowed the rest. When the stock rose to $60 a share, his 50 shares were worth $3,000. He felt like a genius. His brother-in-law suggested buying more. Different stocks this time. General Electric, US Steel, always with borrowed money, always with the promise that prices could only go higher. By October 1929, Robert owned stocks worth nearly $8,000 on paper, but he only owned them on paper. The reality was that he owed his broker more than $6,000 in loans. When the margin calls came, Robert discovered that his $8,000 in stocks were now worth less than $2,000. But he still owed the full $6,000 to his broker. His paper fortune had become a very real debt. Stories like Robert's were playing out in homes across America. The democratization of stock ownership that Charles Mitchell and others had championed with such enthusiasm had become a democratization of financial ruin. The human psychology of financial loss is a curious thing. When people lose money slowly, a little bit each month over several years, they can adjust. They can adapt their expectations and change their habits gradually. But when wealth disappears suddenly, completely, the shock can be overwhelming. It wasn't just the money itself. It was what the money represented. Security for old age, college funds for children, the down payment on a better house in a better neighborhood. Dreams that had seemed so close to reality just days before were now impossibly distant. The psychological impact rippled outward in ways that no economist could have predicted. People who had never owned a single share of stock began to worry about their jobs. If the wealthy were losing money, would they still need as many servants? As many shopkeepers? As many of anything? In the weeks following Black Tuesday, a strange kind of paralysis settled over the American economy. It wasn't that factories suddenly broke down or that crops failed to grow. The physical infrastructure of prosperity was still there. But confidence, that invisible foundation upon which all commerce rests, had been shattered. Consumers stopped buying anything except absolute necessities. Why purchase a new coat when your job might disappear next month? Why buy a radio when your savings had just evaporated? The caution was understandable, but it created a vicious cycle. Reduced spending meant reduced production. Reduced production meant fewer jobs. Fewer jobs meant even less spending. The crash had revealed something troubling about the American economy of the 1920s. Much of the prosperity had been built on borrowed money and borrowed time. The assembly lines that produced automobiles and radios and all the other marvels of modern life were designed to meet ever-increasing demand. When that demand suddenly disappeared, the entire system began to seize up like an engine without oil. By the spring of 1930, bread lines had appeared in major cities. Bread lines in America. The land of opportunity had become, for many, the land of barely getting by. The irony was bitter. The same technological advances that had driven the stock market boom. The mass production techniques, the electrical power, the improved transportation. were now producing goods that fewer and fewer people could afford to buy. Factories that had run 3 shifts to meet demand now struggled to justify running 1 shift. The workers who had felt so prosperous just months before found themselves standing in unemployment lines, clutching their meagre severance pay and wondering when, or if, they might work again. The soup kitchens that opened in major cities were often run by the same charitable organizations that had always helped the desperately poor. But now they were serving former bank clerks and shop managers and skilled tradesmen. People who had never imagined they might need charity found themselves grateful for a bowl of soup and a piece of bread. In the small towns and farming communities, the crash created different but equally devastating problems. The farmers who had borrowed money to expand their operations during the good years now faced foreclosure. Banks that had seemed so solid and permanent began to fail as their loan portfolios turned toxic. When a bank failed in a small town, it wasn't just a financial event. It was the collapse of an institution that had been woven into the fabric of the community for generations. The bank president who had approved mortgages for young couples and business loans for ambitious entrepreneurs suddenly found himself unable to meet his own obligations. The deposits that represented lifetimes of careful saving simply vanished. There was no deposit insurance in those days. When a bank closed its doors, the money inside was usually gone forever. Imagine being a widow who had entrusted her late husband's life insurance money to the local bank. Imagine being a young couple who had saved for years to buy their first home, only to discover that their down payment had disappeared along with their bank. The social contract that held American society together, the belief that hard work and thrift would be rewarded, seemed to have been torn up and thrown away. As 1930 turned into 1931, the crisis deepened rather than healed. The natural resilience of the American economy, which had bounced back from previous downturns, seemed to have been overwhelmed by the scale of the damage. President Herbert Hoover, a man who had built his reputation as an efficient administrator and humanitarian, found himself facing problems that had no easy solutions. Hoover believed deeply in the American tradition of self-reliance. He worried that direct government assistance would create dependency and undermine the work ethic that had made the country great. But self-reliance was difficult when there were no jobs to be found. The unemployment rate climbed steadily. 5%, then 10%, then 15%. Each percentage point represented hundreds of thousands of real people struggling to feed their families and keep their homes. Hoover's administration tried various approaches. They organized conferences with business leaders, urging them to maintain wages and employment levels. They funded public works projects to create jobs. They established lending programs to help banks and businesses stay afloat. But the measures seemed inadequate against the magnitude of the crisis. The confidence that had been lost in October 1929 proved much harder to restore than anyone had anticipated. Meanwhile, the financial investigations began in earnest. Congressional committees summoned the men who had been heroes of the boom years to explain what had gone wrong. Charles Mitchell found himself in the uncomfortable position of defending practices that had seemed perfectly reasonable just months before. Yes, his bank had made extensive loans to stock speculators. Yes, they had encouraged ordinary citizens to borrow money to buy securities. But wasn't that what democracy looked like in the financial world? Wasn't giving everyone a chance to participate in American prosperity a noble goal? The senators and congressmen asking the questions weren't interested in noble goals. They wanted to know why their constituents had lost their life savings. They wanted someone to blame for the breadlines and the unemployment and the despair that was spreading across the country like a plague. Mitchell resigned in disgrace, but his resignation couldn't undo the damage. The easy credit policies that had seemed so beneficial during the boom had created a mountain of debt that now threatened to bury the entire economy. The pool operations that had manipulated stock prices during the good times were revealed in their full cynical glory. Testimony showed how sophisticated investors had coordinated their activities to create artificial demand for stocks, then sold out at the peak, leaving ordinary investors holding worthless paper. It was all perfectly legal, but it felt like theft. The small investors who had trusted that the market was fair and honest discovered that they had been playing a rigged game. Jesse Livermore tried to stay out of the investigations, but his profits from the crash made him a target of public anger. Here was a man who had made $100 million, while ordinary Americans lost everything. The mathematics were simple. His gains had come directly from other people's losses. Livermore understood the hostility, but he also understood that markets are zero-sum games. For every buyer, there must be a seller. For every winner, there must be a loser. He hadn't created the crash. He had simply recognized it earlier than most and positioned himself accordingly. But understanding the mathematics didn't make the hatred any easier to bear. Livermore found himself receiving death threats. He hired bodyguards and changed his daily routines. The fortune that was supposed to represent freedom and security had become a prison of fear and isolation. The great speculator who had mastered the art of reading market psychology discovered that he couldn't master his own demons. The same intense focus that had made him wealthy also made him prone to depression and obsessive behavior. He began making increasingly erratic investments, trying to repeat the success of October 1929. But lightning rarely strikes twice in the same place, and the market conditions that had made his great coup possible were unlikely to return anytime soon. As the depression deepened, the stories of individual hardship multiplied beyond counting. There was the family in Detroit, who had lived comfortably on the father's job at the automobile plant until the layoffs began. First, it was temporary, just until demand picked up. Then it was indefinite. Then the plant closed altogether. The mother took in washing to bring in a few dollars each week. The older children left school to look for any kind of work they could find. The family moved from their comfortable house to a smaller apartment, then to a single room in a boarding house. Each step down the economic ladder was supposed to be temporary. Each sacrifice was made with the expectation that things would get better soon. But soon never came, and the temporary arrangements became permanent features of a new and harder life. There was the small businessman in Ohio who had built a successful hardware store over 20 years of patient work. When his customers stopped buying anything except absolute necessities, his inventory began to pile up unsold. When he couldn't pay his suppliers, they stopped shipping new merchandise. He tried to hold on, liquidating his savings account, then his wife's jewelry, then their children's college funds. But a retail business without customers is like a plant without water. It can survive for a while on stored resources, but eventually it withers and dies. The day he locked the doors of his store for the last time, he stood on the sidewalk, looking at the window display he had arranged so carefully just that morning. 20 years of his life reduced to a closed sign. The agricultural regions faced their own unique challenges. Farmers who had borrowed money to expand their operations during the high prices of the 1920s found themselves trapped in a vicious cycle. Crop prices fell, but their debts remained the same. To service their loans, they needed to produce more, but increased production drove prices even lower. The foreclosures began slowly, then accelerated. Banks that had been eager to lend money for land purchases during the boom years now found themselves owning thousands of acres of farmland they couldn't sell. The human cost was measured not just in dollars, but in the destruction of communities that had existed for generations. When a farm family lost their land, they often had to leave the area entirely to look for work. The young people moved to cities that had no jobs for them. The older ones sometimes simply gave up. Country banks that had survived the Civil War and the panics of the 1890s found themselves unable to withstand the perfect storm of falling land values, defaulted loans, and panicked depositors. When the bank in a small farming community closed, it was often the beginning of the end for the entire town. The general store that extended credit to farmers couldn't collect its accounts. The blacksmith shop that serviced farm equipment had no customers. The grain elevator stood empty. Some of these towns simply disappeared. Houses stood empty until they collapsed from neglect. Main streets that had once bustled with activity on Saturday afternoons became places where the wind blew dust between abandoned storefronts. By 1932, the psychological damage was almost as severe as the economic damage. The generation that had lived through the boom years of the 1920s found it difficult to trust their own judgment anymore. If the experts had been so wrong about the permanence of prosperity, how could ordinary people know what to believe? If the banks had failed, if the stock market had collapsed, if even the government seemed powerless to stop the decline, what institutions could be trusted? The optimism that had been such a defining characteristic of American culture began to give way to a more cautious, skeptical worldview. People who had once embraced new technologies and new opportunities now approached change with suspicion. The marriage rate declined as young couples decided they couldn't afford to start families. The birth rate dropped as existing families concluded they couldn't afford additional children. Even hope for the future seemed like a luxury that many people could no longer afford. The soup kitchens and bread lines became permanent features of the American landscape. Charitable organizations that had expected to provide temporary relief found themselves overwhelmed by the scale and persistence of the need. Men who had once taken pride in providing for their families now stood in line for handouts, their faces bearing expressions of shame and bewilderment. The work ethic that had driven American prosperity seemed meaningless when there was no work to be found. The cultural changes were as profound as the economic ones. Hollywood began making different kinds of movies, stories about ordinary people struggling with hardship rather than tales of glamorous wealth. The fashion industry adapted to customers who had to make their clothes last for years rather than seasons. Popular music reflected the changed mood. The exuberant jazz of the 1920s gave way to more melancholy themes. Songs about lost love and broken dreams resonated with audiences who had experienced their own forms of loss. Even the language began to change. Words like security and stability took on new importance. The vocabulary of speculation and easy wealth that had been so common just a few years before now seemed almost embarrassing. People who had once talked confidently about their investments and their plans for financial independence now spoke more quietly about just getting by. The dreams hadn't necessarily disappeared, but they had been scaled back dramatically. Prudence became a virtue again, in ways it hadn't been for decades. Parents who had encouraged their children to take risks and pursue opportunities now taught them the importance of steady work and careful saving. The election of 1932 brought Franklin Roosevelt to the presidency with a mandate to do something, anything, to address the crisis. Roosevelt's inaugural address contained the famous phrase, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." But his administration understood that fear was only part of the problem. The banking system was in ruins. Thousands of banks had failed, wiping out millions of dollars in deposits. Those that remained open were so cautious about making loans that businesses couldn't get the credit they needed to operate. Roosevelt's solution was characteristically bold. He declared a bank holiday, closing all banks temporarily, while government inspectors examined their books. Only the strongest institutions would be allowed to reopen. It was a dramatic gesture that probably saved the entire banking system from complete collapse. But it also represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between government and finance. The era of laissez-faire capitalism that had dominated American thinking for generations was ending. The Securities and Exchange Commission was established to prevent the kind of manipulation and fraud that had contributed to the crash. The Glass-Steagall Act separated commercial banking from investment banking, ensuring that people's deposits couldn't be risked in speculative ventures. Federal deposit insurance was created to protect individual savers from bank failures. These changes would reshape American finance for the next 70 years. But even as new institutions were being created to prevent future crashes, the human cost of the 1929 disaster continued to accumulate. Jesse Livermore, despite his enormous profits from the crash, found that wealth couldn't protect him from his own psychological demons. He made and lost several more fortunes in the decade that followed, each cycle of gain and loss taking a greater toll on his mental health. The man who had once been celebrated as the greatest speculator of his generation became increasingly isolated and erratic. In 1940, alone in a Manhattan hotel bathroom, Livermore took his own life. His suicide note spoke of being tired of fighting. The fortune he had accumulated meant nothing in the end. Money couldn't buy peace of mind. Charles Mitchell, the banker who had done so much to democratize stock ownership, spent his remaining years working for small brokerage firms, largely forgotten by the financial world that had once celebrated him. His vision of widespread stock ownership had been correct, but his timing and methods had been disastrous. Richard Whitney, the hero of Black Thursday, who had briefly stemmed the panic with his bold purchases, was eventually revealed as an embezzler. The man who had represented the integrity of the financial establishment had been stealing from his own clients to cover his losses. Whitney was sentenced to prison in 1938, and his fall from grace completed the destruction of public trust in the old Wall Street establishment. Professor Irving Fisher lived longer than most of the other major figures from the crash, but he never recovered his reputation. The economist who had proclaimed a permanently high plateau became a cautionary tale about the dangers of overconfidence. Fisher continued teaching at Yale, but his students knew him primarily as the man who had made one of the worst market predictions in history. He spent years trying to rebuild his credibility, but the memory of September 1929 overshadowed everything else he accomplished. When Fisher died in 1947, his obituaries focused more on his failed prediction than on his genuine contributions to economic theory. He had become a symbol of intellectual hubris, a reminder that even the smartest people can be catastrophically wrong about the future. The small investors who had believed in Fisher's vision of permanent prosperity faced their own long struggles to recover. Many never did. The middle-class families who had risked their savings on margin purchases found themselves starting over from nothing in middle age. Some adapted and eventually rebuilt their lives. Others never quite recovered from the psychological trauma of losing everything they had worked so hard to accumulate. The dream of easy wealth was replaced by a grim determination to simply survive. The children who lived through the Great Depression absorbed lessons that would shape their behavior for the rest of their lives. They learned to save string and aluminum foil and every other resource that might someday prove useful. They learned to be suspicious of debt and skeptical of investment schemes that promised quick returns. This generation would become known for its caution and frugality. They would be the parents who insisted their children learn practical skills and pursue stable careers. They would be the grandparents who kept substantial amounts of cash in safe deposit boxes because they never quite trusted banks again. But they would also be the generation that built the prosperity of the post-war years. Their hard-earned wisdom about the value of steady work and careful planning would create the foundation for the longest period of economic growth in American history. The regulations they supported and the institutions they created would help prevent another crash as severe as 1929 for decades to come. Yet, human nature remained constant. Each new generation would rediscover the intoxicating appeal of speculative bubbles. The details would change, but the fundamental psychology would remain the same. In the 1960s, it was the nifty 50 stocks that could supposedly only go up. In the 1980s, it was junk bonds and leveraged buyouts. In the late 1990s, it was internet companies with no profits but unlimited potential. Each time, the same pattern repeated. Initial skepticism gave way to tentative participation, then to widespread enthusiasm, then to pure speculation divorced from any rational analysis of value. Each time, there were experts who proclaimed that this time was different, that the old rules no longer applied, that new technologies or new financial instruments had fundamentally changed the nature of markets. And each time, eventually, reality reasserted itself. Prices that had risen far beyond any reasonable relationship to underlying value came crashing back down to earth. The cycles became more frequent and more global as financial markets became more interconnected. A crisis that began in one country could now spread around the world in a matter of hours. But the human stories remained remarkably consistent. The dreams of quick wealth, the gradual abandonment of caution, the inevitable disappointment when the bubble burst. The crash of 1929 holds up a mirror to human nature that reflects truths about ourselves we would often prefer not to see. It shows us how easily fear can turn to greed, and how quickly greed can turn back to fear. It reminds us that markets are not just mathematical abstractions, but human institutions, driven by human emotions and subject to human frailties. The numbers on the ticker tape represent real people making real decisions based on real hopes and fears. Understanding this truth is perhaps the most valuable lesson we can take from those October days in 1929. Markets will always be volatile, because people will always be human. The challenge is learning to participate in that system without being destroyed by it. The reforms that followed the crash, the securities laws, the banking regulations, the deposit insurance, these were attempts to build guardrails around human nature. They couldn't prevent people from making bad decisions, but they could limit how much damage those decisions could do to the broader economy. These institutions served America well for many decades, preventing the kind of systemic collapse that occurred in the 1930s. But they also created a certain complacency. Each generation that grew up without experiencing a major financial crisis became more willing to take risks that previous generations would have avoided. As you think about these stories from the past, consider what they might teach us about the future. The specific details of the next crisis will certainly be different, But the human psychology that drives market cycles remains surprisingly constant. The teenagers who are just beginning to invest through smartphone apps are not so different from the shoeshine boys who bought Radio Corporation of America stock in 1928. They have the same hopes for a better life, the same belief that they can outsmart the market, the same vulnerability to the crowd psychology that creates bubbles. The challenge for each generation is to learn from history without being paralyzed by it. Markets do crash, but they also create genuine wealth over time. The key is finding the balance between prudent caution and reasonable risk-taking. Perhaps the most important lesson from 1929 is the importance of humility. The experts who proclaimed permanent prosperity were not fools or charlatans. They were intelligent, well-informed people who genuinely believed in their analysis. But they forgot that markets are fundamentally unpredictable in the short term, driven by forces that no model can fully capture. The same humility that would have served them well then would serve us well today. We cannot predict when the next crash will come or what will trigger it, but we can prepare for uncertainty by avoiding excessive debt, maintaining emergency reserves, and remembering that sustainable wealth is built slowly over time. The story of the 1929 crash is ultimately a story about hope and disappointment, about dreams and reality, about the eternal human struggle between what we want to believe and what the world will actually give us. It reminds us that financial markets are not separate from human life, but deeply embedded in it. The numbers that flash across our screens represent not just abstract values, but human dreams and fears and aspirations. When we understand that truth, really understand it, we can approach markets with both appropriate respect and appropriate skepticism. We can participate in the great engine of capitalism without being crushed by it. The men and women who lived through October 1929 have mostly passed away now. Their voices have grown quiet, but their stories remain as relevant today as they were 90 years ago. They remind us that the price of prosperity is eternal vigilance, not just against external threats, but against our own tendency to believe that this time is different, that we have somehow transcended the ancient cycles of boom and bust. The market will open again tomorrow, just as it has every business day since 1892. New dreams will be born, new fortunes will be made and lost, new stories will be written in the endless human drama of hope and fear and greed and caution. And somewhere, in the quiet hours before dawn, the ghosts of Black Tuesday will whisper their warnings to anyone wise enough to listen. Sleep well. The warnings from Black Tuesday echo across the decades in ways both subtle and profound. They whisper in the morning conversations of elderly investors who remember their grandparents' stories. They murmur in the cautious advice of financial advisors who have studied market history. They speak in the careful regulations that still govern how banks can lend money and how securities must be sold. But perhaps most importantly, they live in the collective memory of a nation that learned, through bitter experience, that prosperity is fragile and must be handled with care. In the years that followed the Great Depression, America rebuilt itself with a different understanding of risk and reward. The factories that rose from the ashes of the 30s were built on more solid foundations. The banks that reopened their doors operated under stricter rules. The investors who returned to the market did so with hard-earned wisdom about the difference between speculation and investment. There was something almost sacred about the way that generation approached money. They had seen fortunes vanish overnight. They had watched neighbors lose their homes and their dignity. They understood, in a way that perhaps no generation before or since has understood, that financial security is not a birthright, but a privilege that must be earned and protected. The children who grew up during the Depression absorbed these lessons through their paws. They learned to darn socks and repair shoes, long past the point where replacement would have been more economical. They learned to grow vegetables in backyard gardens and to preserve food for the winter months ahead. More importantly, they learned to distinguish between wants and needs with a precision that would serve them well throughout their lives. A new dress was a luxury to be saved for. A meal at a restaurant was a special occasion to be cherished. Debt was something to be avoided except for the most essential purchases. A home, perhaps, or a reliable automobile. These habits of mind would shape American culture for decades. The prosperity of the 1950s and 60s was built on this foundation of careful saving and conservative spending. Families that had learned to live within their means during hard times found themselves genuinely wealthy when good times returned. But memory is a curious thing. It fades with time and distance. The children who grew up during the Depression would tell their own children about the hardships they had endured, but the stories would lack the visceral impact of lived experience. By the 1960s, a new generation was coming of age, one that had known only prosperity. To them, the stories of breadlines and bank failures seemed like ancient history, as remote as tales of the Civil War or the frontier days. This generation looked at the stock market with fresh eyes, unburdened by the fears that had constrained their parents. They saw opportunity where their elders saw danger. They embraced risk where their parents counseled caution. The Nifty 50 stocks of the late 60s and early 70s seemed to offer the same promise of effortless wealth that Radio Corporation of America had offered in 1928. Companies like IBM and Polaroid and McDonald's were growing so rapidly that their stock prices seemed almost secondary to their limitless potential. Investment advisors began to speak of a new kind of stock, one that was so fundamentally sound that price was irrelevant. Buy and hold forever, they advised. These companies are so well managed and so well positioned that they can only go up. The language was different, but the underlying psychology was remarkably similar to what had driven the speculation of the 1920s. When the Nifty 50 bubble burst in the mid-70s, it caught investors off guard in ways that would have been familiar to the victims of Black Tuesday. Stock prices fell not by the 10 or 20% that cautious investors might have expected, but by 60, 70, even 80%. Polaroid stock, which had traded above $140 in 1972, fell to less than $15 by 1974. The company was still profitable, still growing, still innovating. But the stock price had been based on expectations of perfection that no earthly company could possibly fulfill. The investors who had bought at the peak discovered the same bitter truth that their grandparents had learned in 1929. Markets that rise on hope and enthusiasm eventually fall when reality fails to meet expectations. But the lesson was temporary. Within a few years, new opportunities would emerge to test the next generation's wisdom and patience. The 1980s brought leveraged buyouts and junk bonds, complex financial instruments that promised to unlock hidden value in underperforming companies. The pioneers of this movement, men like Michael Milken and Ivan Boesky, became celebrities in much the same way that Charles Mitchell and Jesse Livermore had been celebrated in the 20s. The mathematics were seductive. By borrowing enormous amounts of money at high interest rates, investors could buy entire companies, restructure them for efficiency, and sell them for tremendous profits. The leverage that had destroyed so many small investors in 1929 was now being applied to entire corporations. For a while, it worked brilliantly. Sleepy companies were awakened by new management teams with strong incentives to cut costs and increase profits. Shareholders who had watched their investments stagnate for years suddenly found themselves receiving buyout offers at substantial premiums. But leverage is a double-edged sword. It magnifies gains during good times and magnifies losses when conditions deteriorate. When the economy softened in the late 80s, many of the companies that had been loaded with debt during buyouts found themselves unable to service their obligations. The junk bond market collapsed, taking with it the fortunes of investors who had believed that high yields came without correspondingly high risks. Milken was prosecuted for securities violations and sent to prison. Boesky suffered a similar fate. Once again, the financial heroes of one era became the cautionary tales of the next. The pattern was becoming clear to those who cared to look. Every 15 or 20 years, a new generation would discover some variation of the same fundamental idea, that borrowed money could be used to generate extraordinary returns with acceptable risk. The details would always be different. The language would evolve. The specific instruments and techniques would become more sophisticated. But the underlying psychology remained constant. The 1990s brought perhaps the most spectacular example yet: the Internet stock bubble. This time, the promise was not just of higher profits, but of a fundamental transformation in how business would be conducted. Companies that had never earned a dollar of profit were valued at billions of dollars based on their potential to capture market share in the emerging digital economy. Traditional measures of value, earnings, dividends, book value, were dismissed as obsolete concepts from an industrial age that was rapidly becoming irrelevant. The parallels to 1929 were almost eerie. Once again, shoeshine boys were giving stock tips, though now they were called day traders, and they operated from home computers rather than street corners. Once again, ordinary Americans were borrowing money to buy stocks they didn't understand. Once again, experts proclaimed that the old rules no longer applied. The Nasdaq index, which tracked many of the hottest internet stocks, rose from less than 1,000 in 1996 to over 5,000 in March of 2000. Companies with names like Pets.com and Webvan.com saw their stock prices multiply dozens of times in a matter of months. The crash, when it came, was swift and merciless. By October 2002, the Nasdaq had fallen back below 1,200, a decline of more than 70% from its peak. Trillions of dollars in paper wealth simply evaporated. The human stories were heartbreakingly familiar. Middle-aged workers who had cashed out their pension plans to buy internet stocks found themselves facing retirement with nothing. Young couples who had borrowed against their homes to speculate in day trading discovered that their paper profits had turned into very real debts. But even this disaster was not enough to permanently cure Americans of their appetite for speculative excess. The very policies that were implemented to address the aftermath of the internet bubble, particularly the Federal Reserve's decision to keep interest rates at historically low levels, would soon create the conditions for an even larger and more destructive bubble in real estate. The housing boom of the mid-2000s displayed all the classic characteristics of speculative mania. Homes that had been places to live became investment vehicles to be flipped for quick profits. People with modest incomes were encouraged to buy houses they couldn't afford with loans they didn't understand. The financial industry created complex instruments, mortgage-backed securities, collateralized debt obligations, credit default swaps. That spread the risk of these questionable loans throughout the global financial system. Just as the pool operations of the 1920s had concentrated speculation in a few popular stocks, these new instruments concentrated speculation in residential real estate. When home prices began to fall in 2006 and 2007, the entire structure began to collapse. Banks that had seemed unshakable found themselves insolvent overnight. Investment firms that had survived for decades simply disappeared. The parallels to 1929 were unmistakable, but with one crucial difference. This time, the government and the Federal Reserve were prepared to take dramatic action to prevent a complete collapse of the financial system. The bailouts and stimulus programs that followed were controversial, but they succeeded in preventing the kind of economic catastrophe that had followed the stock market crash. Unemployment rose, but not to the 25% levels seen during the Great Depression. Banks failed, but deposit insurance protected most individual savers. Yet, for all the government intervention, the human cost was still enormous. Millions of families lost their homes to foreclosure. Retirement accounts that had been built up over decades were wiped out. Young people found themselves unable to get jobs or credit, their economic futures clouded by circumstances beyond their control. The psychological impact was profound, particularly on the generation that came of age during the crisis. They learned to be skeptical of debt, wary of financial institutions, and suspicious of get-rich-quick schemes in ways that echoed the lessons learned by their great-grandparents during the Depression. But human nature is remarkably resilient, and memory is frustratingly short. By 2010, new bubbles were already beginning to form in different markets. Technology stocks began to rise again, driven by the promise of social media and mobile computing. Government bonds reached historically high prices as investors sought safety at any price. Each new cycle brought variations on familiar themes. The FANG stocks, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google, became the new Nifty 50, companies so fundamentally strong that their stock prices seemed almost irrelevant to their long-term prospects. Cryptocurrency emerged as perhaps the purest expression of speculative mania since the South Sea bubble of 1720. Digital currencies with no intrinsic value and no backing from any government or institution saw their prices rise by thousands of percent based on little more than collective belief in their future potential. The language was new: blockchain technology, smart contracts, decentralized finance. But the psychology was ancient. Once again, people were mortgaging their homes and cashing out their retirement accounts to speculate in assets they didn't understand. The democratization of trading through smartphone apps like Robinhood created new opportunities for speculation that would have amazed Charles Mitchell. Suddenly, anyone with a phone could trade stocks and options with no commissions and no minimum account balance. The GameStop phenomenon of early 2021 showed how social media could amplify market manias in ways that even the pool operators of the 1920s could never have imagined. A struggling video game retailer became the center of a speculative frenzy, driven not by fundamental analysis, but by collective action coordinated through internet message boards. Individual investors, many of them young people with little market experience, drove the stock price from less than $5 to over $400 in a matter of weeks. The gain was temporary. The stock eventually fell back to more reasonable levels. But the episode demonstrated that the power to create market bubbles had been truly democratized. Professional investors who had bet against GameStop's stock price found themselves facing losses of billions of dollars. The traditional relationship between Wall Street institutions and individual investors had been temporarily inverted, with amateur traders inflicting damage on sophisticated hedge funds. But the underlying dynamics remained unchanged. Most of the individual investors who participated in the GameStop rally bought near the peak and sold near the bottom, losing money in the process. The mathematics of speculation had not been repealed, merely disguised by new technology and new rhetoric. As we reflect on these cycles of boom and bust, certain patterns emerge with startling consistency. Each generation seems destined to rediscover the same basic truths about markets and human nature, usually at considerable cost to their financial well-being. The specific triggers change. New technologies, new financial instruments, new economic conditions. But the underlying psychology remains remarkably stable. People want to believe that they have discovered a path to wealth that does not require the slow, patient accumulation of capital over time. They want to believe that this time is different, that the old rules have been suspended, that they are smarter or luckier or better informed than the millions of investors who have made similar mistakes throughout history. The desire is understandable, even admirable in some ways. It reflects the human capacity for hope, for ambition, for the belief that individual effort can overcome seemingly impossible odds. But markets are not casinos where individual skill can guarantee success. They are complex systems driven by the collective actions of millions of participants, each making decisions based on incomplete information and uncertain expectations about the future. In such an environment, humility becomes not just a virtue, but a survival skill. The investors who prosper over the long term are usually not the ones who swing for the fences on every pitch, but those who understand the difference between reasonable risk and reckless speculation. The story of Jesse Livermore is particularly instructive in this regard. Here was a man who possessed genuine skill at reading market psychology and timing his trades. His profits from the 1929 crash demonstrated that it was possible, at least temporarily, to outsmart the market. But even Livermore could not sustain his success over the long term. The same psychological traits that made him a brilliant speculator, the intense focus, the willingness to risk everything on a single bet, the belief that he could predict market movements, eventually became sources of self-destruction. His story reminds us that markets are ultimately unpredictable in the short term, no matter how much skill or experience we bring to bear on them. The trader who wins consistently for years can lose everything in a single bad decision or an unexpected turn of events. This is not to say that investing is futile, or that markets cannot create genuine wealth. They can and do, but usually in ways that are less dramatic and more gradual than the stories of speculative success that capture our imagination. The wealth created by steady, patient investing may be less exciting than the fortunes made and lost in speculative bubbles, but it is also more durable. The family that saves 10% of their income each year and invests it in diversified assets will, over time, build substantial wealth, even if they never pick a single winning stock. This approach requires qualities that are often in short supply during speculative manias: patience, discipline, and the ability to ignore the crowd when it is rushing toward the latest get-rich-quick scheme. The regulatory reforms that followed each major market crash were attempts to institutionalize these qualities, to build patience and discipline into the structure of the financial system itself. The Securities and Exchange Commission requires companies to disclose detailed financial information, making it harder for investors to be misled by false promises or hidden risks. Bank regulations limit how much money institutions can lend relative to their capital, reducing the likelihood that a wave of defaults will bring down the entire system. Deposit insurance protects individual savers from bank failures, eliminating the panic runs that once destroyed healthy institutions along with weak ones. Circuit breakers halt trading when markets fall too rapidly, providing a cooling-off period that can prevent panic selling from feeding on itself. These reforms have made the financial system more stable and more resilient than it was in 1929. They have not eliminated market volatility. Nothing could do that as long as human beings are involved. But they have reduced the likelihood that a single crash will destroy the entire economy. Yet each new generation of regulators faces the same challenge: how to maintain vigilance against risks that may not have manifested themselves for decades. The specific forms that speculation takes evolve constantly, often outpacing the ability of rules and regulations to keep up. The cryptocurrency boom of the 2010s, for example, largely took place outside the traditional regulatory framework. Digital currencies were neither stocks nor bonds nor commodities, and existing laws were not well equipped to address the unique risks they presented. Similarly, the complex financial instruments that contributed to the 2008 crisis were often structured to exploit regulatory gaps rather than to serve legitimate economic purposes. Innovation in finance, like innovation in any field, can be used for constructive or destructive purposes. Perhaps the most important lesson from the long history of market crashes is that financial education cannot be separated from moral education. Understanding how markets work is important, but it is not sufficient if that understanding is not accompanied by wisdom about human nature and its limitations. The people who lost money in 1929 were not necessarily ignorant about finance. Many of them were successful businessmen, educated professionals, and experienced investors. But they allowed their judgment to be clouded by greed, fear, and the intoxicating belief that they had discovered something that others had missed. Charles Mitchell genuinely believed that he was democratizing capitalism and giving ordinary Americans a chance to participate in the nation's prosperity. His motives were not entirely selfish, even if his methods proved to be disastrous. Irving Fisher was a brilliant economist whose contributions to financial theory are still studied today. His permanently high plateau comment was not the product of ignorance, but of overconfidence in his ability to predict the unpredictable. These men were not villains in the traditional sense. They were human beings who made very human mistakes, mistakes that continue to be repeated in different forms by each new generation of market participants. Understanding this truth is perhaps the beginning of wisdom when it comes to investing. Markets are not abstract mathematical constructs, but human institutions, subject to all the strengths and weaknesses that characterize human nature. The challenge for individual investors is learning to participate in this system without being destroyed by it. This requires not just technical knowledge about stocks and bonds and compound interest, but emotional intelligence about our own motivations and limitations. It means recognizing when our desire for quick profits is leading us to take risks we cannot afford. It means understanding the difference between genuine opportunities and seductive fantasies. It means having the courage to be boring when everyone around us is getting excited about the latest investment fad. Most importantly, it means accepting that sustainable wealth is built slowly, through the patient accumulation of assets over time, rather than through spectacular bets on unpredictable market movements. This is not a popular message in a culture that celebrates entrepreneurial risk-taking and instant gratification. The stories that capture our imagination are usually about dramatic successes and failures, not about the quiet accumulation of wealth through steady saving and sensible investing. But the mathematics of compound interest, boring though they may be, are more reliable than the psychology of speculative bubbles. Money that is saved and invested consistently over decades will grow into substantial wealth even at modest rates of return. The key is starting early and staying disciplined, avoiding the temptation to chase the latest hot investment or to abandon a long-term plan because of short-term market volatility. As we look towards the future, we can be certain that new forms of speculation will emerge to test the wisdom and patience of each generation. The specific details are impossible to predict, but the underlying patterns will almost certainly remain the same. There will be new technologies that promise to revolutionize how business is conducted. There will be new financial instruments that appear to offer higher returns with lower risk. There will be new experts who proclaim that the old rules no longer apply. And there will be a new generation of investors, unburdened by direct experience of previous crashes, who will believe that they can succeed where others have failed. The only defense against this cycle is education. Not just technical education about how markets work, but historical education about how they have worked in the past. The patterns that led to the crash of 1929 are not ancient history, but living realities that continue to shape market behavior today. Understanding these patterns will not guarantee success in investing, but it may help us avoid the most catastrophic mistakes. It may help us recognize when our emotions are leading us astray, and when the crowd psychology that drives bubbles is beginning to take hold. Most importantly, it may help us maintain perspective during both the euphoria of bull markets and the despair of crashes, remembering that markets are ultimately cyclical and that both good times and bad times are temporary. The men and women who lived through Black Tuesday have left us a precious gift, their stories. These stories remind us that behind every statistic about market performance, there are real people making real decisions about their financial futures. They remind us that markets are not just about money, but about hope and fear, about dreams deferred and opportunities seized, about the eternal human struggle to build something lasting in an uncertain world. When we understand markets in these human terms, we can approach them with both appropriate respect and appropriate caution. We can participate in the great engine of capitalism without being consumed by it. We can learn from the mistakes of previous generations without being paralyzed by their failures. We can pursue reasonable returns without succumbing to the fantasy of effortless wealth. And perhaps most importantly, we can pass on to our own children and grandchildren not just financial assets, but financial wisdom, the hard-earned understanding that prosperity is fragile and must be built carefully, brick by brick, year after year, with patience and discipline and humility. This may be the most valuable inheritance we can leave. Not a fortune built on speculation and luck, but the knowledge of how to build and preserve wealth over the long term. As the night deepens and the world grows quiet, listen carefully to the whispers of history. They speak of dreams and disappointments, of fortunes made and lost, of the eternal cycle of hope and fear that drives markets and shapes human destiny. They remind us that we are not the first generation to face uncertain economic times, and we will not be the last. But we can learn from those who came before us, honoring their memory by avoiding their mistakes and building on their hard-won wisdom. The markets will open again tomorrow, just as they have for more than a century. New dreams will be born, new risks will be taken, new stories will be written in the endless human drama of finance and economics. But tonight, in the quiet hours before dawn, we can rest in the knowledge that understanding the past gives us power over the future. Not the power to predict what will happen, but the power to respond wisely to whatever may come. Sleep peacefully and dream wisely. The lessons of Black Tuesday will be waiting when you wake.